You are listening to Natural Born Alchemist.
Welcome to episode number 227 of the Natural Born Alchemist podcast. My name is Alex and I'll be your host. Yet again this month we are going to focus on psychedelic history because sometimes it is nice to have a theme. My guest in this episode is a filmmaker by the name of Chris Rice. Chris has made 2 documentaries called DMT: A Lost History and Cannabis: A Lost History. And soon Sacred Mushrooms: A Lost History will be coming out. Do you notice a theme here? No wonder I titled this episode as I did. So let's do this. Enough ramblings from me. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So can you tell the listeners a bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, my name is Chris Rice. I am the director of the documentary films Cannabis: A Lost History and DMT: A Lost History. I also do lectures. I write. I make other YouTube videos and host a podcast as well.
So if you want to say it briefly, what is the lost history of cannabis and DMT?
So essentially, if we look back at the historical record of the use of psychoactive substances, it goes back for thousands of years, basically since the advent of civilization. I probably, like yourself, was raised to believe that drugs were some type of new invention of the 20th century, sort of a byproduct of the hippie movement, if you will, but it isn't that at all. I mean, there have been substances used for thousands upon thousands of years as food, as medicine, as sacrament, to explore the mysteries of our own consciousness. And I think that it's worth informing people of that, you know?
I always wonder what it would be like to have a first mushroom trip, for instance, living in the Stone Age compared to now. I mean, it would be the same experience, but you wouldn't have to have all that baggage where you would I wonder if you would be as equally amazed or you would be more like, oh, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I obviously don't know the answer to it myself either, but what I can say is if you look back at the Stone Age in particular, in regards to mushrooms, there is a growing body of evidence that those people did use psychedelic mushrooms, and in fact, it may have led to the development of art. Cave paintings seem like they are intrinsically tied to the use of psychoactive mushrooms. And there are some examples of this where people are actually depicted with mushrooms for heads in some of the oldest cave paintings.
Why do you think the scientific community, the accepted scientific community, look down on the use of psychedelics as a tool? Because it almost seems like they view it as some sort of, well, if that's true, then humanity has been cheating.
Yeah, I regarding that, I kind of feel like it's probably a misinterpretation on their part of what is going on when you're in that state of consciousness. For instance, I guess the question would be, are we exploring the outer reaches of our mind, or are we simply inebriating ourselves in some way so that we can feel fucked up? I think that is kind of the mainstream interpretation of people using these substances. They're just trying to get high. They're just trying to get fucked up. I obviously don't interpret it that way. I don't believe our ancestors typically interpreted it that way either. They had a deep spiritual connection with these plants, and these plants seem to have a deep spiritual connection with us. So much so, in fact, that, and you may be able to confirm this, I know that in my own experience, when I am on psychedelic substances, it makes me think about my relationship to the ecology of the planet. And it kind of puts that front and center. And I know that that's the case for a lot of other people as well.
When you look at history with psychedelic eyes, you can almost see proof everywhere. So what have you done in those films you made to try and eliminate things that could be a projection of yourself? Because you can read into it in anything, really.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely think that that is a real issue. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's a common phrase here. Much of my work is predicated on the work of existing ethnobotanists, anthropologists, and ethnopharmacologists, and researchers in ancient Greek classicism and things along those lines. For instance, Carl Ruck, who I believe teaches at BU, just a few miles down the road here. Great fan of his work. There's also Chris Bennett. A lot of his research is kind of illustrated in my documentary as well. So it's less so my own interpretation of it and more so a presentation of the research, as opposed to people having to read these kind of heady academic papers. I try and spell it out in a way that is more readily palatable to the average listener.
So does your documentaries deal with the soma and mana?
Yes, to some degree. I think in DMT: A Lost History, I do discuss mana, and soma is definitely something that I do put a lot of thought into. That is discussed in DMT: A Lost History as well. Although I don't even necessarily agree with my own interpretation in that film as to what soma is. In my opinion, it really could be a number of different plants. I've had discussions with Chris Bennett, who I referenced a moment ago, and he really seems to believe soma is in fact cannabis and not any ayahuasca analog. R. Gordon Wasson, on the other hand, believed it was likely Amanita muscaria mushrooms. McKenna believed it was psilocybe-containing species. So there are a lot of different interpretations as to what it was. But what we can say is that it was something extremely significant to the ancient Vedic people, and that they basically revered it as a god. And then somewhere along the lines, Hinduism ceased using whatever the soma elixir actually was.
And what kind of proof do they have for arguing that soma could be cannabis?
There is actually, I wouldn't be able to point you to the specific anthropologist off the top of my head, but there was someone who actually discovered a bowl used in the production of cannabis. In the production of soma, a bowl used in the production of soma. In fact, it may have been a soma stone, kind of like a mortar and pestle situation. And it allegedly contained cannabis residue.
As far as evidence of psychedelics in the past, we have the cave paintings that could be a sort of evidence, and then this soma connection in the Hindi culture. But is there anything in between, because it's quite empty?
Well, I mean, one thing that I would point to is modern egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies in New Guinea, for instance, where they continue to use psilocybe mushrooms. Kava seems to be very prominent in these types of cultures as well. Iboga. And there's also some evidence, in the ancient world to suggest, outside of ancient India, in ancient China, there is use of cannabis and opium. There are ancient gravestones that appear to contain cannabis for some reason or another. There are puma bone snorting tubes that have been discovered that date back thousands of years, that have been found in South America, that were that are thought to be used with yopo. Yopo is the seed of a tree that grows in South America, and it contains dimethyltryptamine, DMT. But so there's a lot of evidence in the ancient world, between the time of the cave paintings and the ancient Vedic people, but then thereafter, especially in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and so forth, there is additional evidence there as well.
You have this famous story of Moses and the burning bush, and people have claimed it could be DMT and that, but isn't all that projection, even though it's an acacia tree?
Well, I mean, the acacia tree is native to that region of the world. Um, Moses' experience was certainly otherworldly. Definitely could be something that is in line with the DMT experience, where you meet some type of higher power or a higher consciousness, a higher intellect at the very least, in comparison to oneself. Acacia does grow, native in that region of the world as well. So I think that juxtaposition is what leads people to believe that may be the case. But that's not my original theory or anything like that. That has been studied by professors in Hebrew studies.
These days, if somebody writes down a psychedelic experience, they usually write that, oh, I had a psychedelic experience, and then they describe it. So 1,000 years ago, maybe some of those sacred texts are psychedelic experiences. Wouldn't they have written a term for it in those times? Because it seems to be devoid of saying oh, I took this or that, apart from maybe Soma then.
Yeah, so I actually have a couple of different answers to that question. First, at that time there are some more direct descriptions of Soma, which is just what they happen to call the plant at that time. Of Bang, Bang being a concoction consisting of cannabis. But then also, in Moses talking about the burning bush, they don't go so specifically as to describe what bush it is. But the very fact that he is talking to a burning bush seems like it may be analogous to, some type of plant causing his psychoactive experience. With that said, though, I think that there's also the possibility that they were trying to speak in coded language, in metaphors, as they so often did, just in a way to allow the priestly class of the ancient world to keep their status in society. As you may know, prior to Martin Luther, religion was kind of held in the hands of a selected few intellectual peoples, priestly class and so forth. And it was only really disseminated democratically in the way that it is now after the invention of the printing press. So we're looking at that through a modern lens, and attributing things that we would do in modern times to the ancient world.
Sometimes find it strange that a society or a culture that uses psychedelics, if they did use it occasionally, that they would ever move away from it.
Yeah, and I've heard varying theories on this, especially, for instance, with Soma. Some people claim that an over-harvesting of the Soma plant led to its scarcity, and then therefore, people ended up no longer using it in their practices. There's also the possibility that for instance, when ancient Roman culture took over the majority of the world at that time, that they would have suppressed something that they considered, hedonistic or whatever. Realistically, I don't know the causes for any of this stuff. It'll be conjecture on my part to describe in any way, but we do have evidence that continues through the Middle Ages and so forth of the use of some of these substances. Less so DMT, but definitely cannabis.
I always imagine a group of nomadic hunters laying down, smoking weed or something, and then they're watching a neighboring tribe starting to build a farm and a house, settling, and they're like, "Oh, what are you doing? Relax." And then, because that's the trouble, that's when the troubles began.
It's funny that you say that, because I understand your interpretation of that, but when you look at some of the ancient writings regarding people who used cannabis, it seemed to correlate with those people also being violent. And I know obviously that's true up until reefer madness in the 20th century and so forth as well. But like the Hashishans, which later came to be known as assassins, they, for instance, used cannabis regularly, used hash regularly, and also assassinated people. Prior to that, I believe it was Herodotus spoke of, the tribe that served as the police force for ancient Greece, and that they used cannabis as well. So it's kind of interesting to see it treated in a way as relatively passive in modern times, and much more aggressive historically.
Not sure, I can't recall the source, but I remember reading that the assassins, they were given large quantities of hash, and then they had a psychedelic trip, and then after that experience, their leader said like, well, that's what happens when you die. And then they weren't really using it when they were killing people. They were just like, when they actually die, they'll go to that trip place, it's like a way to manipulate them. At least that's one thing I read.
Yeah, I've actually heard similar things regarding that too. And I think there was some other, pleasure-oriented things involved around that as well. Like they were presented with naked women and things like that, or money, whatever the case was. But yeah, it was definitely a tactic to get people to do what they wanted them to do. That's for sure.
Well, my example there of those people, nomadics, watching the other tribe building houses and that, I was meaning also that the troubles began when we started to settle, because when we were nomadic, we were more free.
I think that's true. And we were talking about psilocybe a little bit ago. I think that, obviously as more and more of our society began to become structured in the way that it is now, with houses and roads and so forth, that would lead to, less and less mushrooms that we're able to find, because obviously the houses would be in the way of the mushrooms, the roads would be in the way of the mushrooms, and frankly, the pollution of a growing population could also prevent the mushrooms from growing. So as culture progresses, the plants seem to recede back into the forests, and the forests began to shrink. So I think that there was a lot more psychedelic experience taking place in the ancient world than there was up until the recent modern times.
Studying the history of the Mongols and Genghis Khan and that, I found an interesting bit that because they were nomadic and they were also a shamanic culture. I don't know if they used any substance or anything like that, but they did take over most of the world, and they did kill a lot of people. The reason they could kill so many people and take over the world was because they viewed settled people as lesser humans. And I always found that interesting, because in a sense maybe they were right. It's not right to kill them perhaps, but philosophically maybe you become lesser because you become trapped, and you want your possessions, and you become trapped in this place with a fence and a yard and a house.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely get the trappings of modern life kind of preventing you from being as hard of a person as you could otherwise be. I would say that's definitely true of people in modern times. I don't have to do very heavy duty manual labor on a regular basis outside of, intentional exercise. So I think, by contrast, if I was up against a Mongol, I would probably die very quickly. And I'm sure that's true of, most people as well. We spend most of our lives on computers or in cafes, not training to be killing machines.
So why do you think it's important to know about the past of psychedelics? What good is it now?
I think that the people who are opposed to psychedelics in particular should see that it's not something new, it's not something hedonistic, it's not something evil. It's something that has been a part of humanity since the beginning of time. And for us to suddenly suppress this within the past 100 years is antithetical to progress.
Do you think it's possible, because I've had a few conversations and it's always amazed me, to be really into psychedelics and do really deep trips and still remain an atheist?
That's a great question too. I personally don't, I don't believe in God in the sense of a bearded man in the sky or anything like that. And prior to having psychedelic experiences, I probably would have categorized myself as an atheist. But after seeing some of the things that I've seen, I would lean more towards agnosticism, in that I don't truthfully know, what's beyond that cosmic door. I don't know what's really out there. And I don't think any of us necessarily do. What I could say is that the psychedelic experiences will make you more open to the possibility of a God. And I think if you are somebody who is presently religious, they may make you question the very strict dogma that you presently believe in.
Because I've talked to people who are not agnostic. I mean, they are atheists, and they just say the psychedelics is very good a very good tool, but it's all in the mind, and I just can't imagine what kind of trips they've been on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either, man, but like I've spoken with scientists about this and so forth. There's definitely varying opinions. Some people just look at the very biocentric method and believe that you're simply replacing the serotonin in your 5-HT receptors with psilocybe or with LSD for that matter. And as a result, you're having a hallucination with something that does stimulate the serotonergic receptors. So much in that way, you're flooding that receptor with something that it responds well to, and therefore you're just having a psychoactive experience, a hallucination because of that. On the other hand, some people, and I might place myself in this latter camp, interpret it more as a way of receiving information that your brain wouldn't typically receive, because in default neural mode, it seems to serve as kind of a gating mechanism. It's not advantageous to a hunter-gatherer society to be tripping balls all the time. And so therefore our brain has these very, finely grooved pathways for visual cortex, audio cortex, olfactory cortex, all these cortices operating in tandem, but separately from one another. Whereas that certainly is not the case in the psychedelic state, as has been illustrated by the MRIs performed by Amanda Fielding.
Every time somebody tells me it's an hallucination, I always recount this experience I had seeing this being walk towards me, and I looked away, and then I looked back, and it had traveled a distance since I saw it the last time. And to me, I don't think a hallucination moves through space and time if I'm not looking at it,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. As far as hallucinations, I suppose you could hallucinate anything. But to me, the reason that I feel like the psychedelic state is more than just a hallucination is largely due to the insights and the epiphanies that you will have in this state of consciousness. And that may be that you don't have the ego blocking, you from thinking about things that are a little more difficult to wrestle with. But it could also be that you're receiving information from a being higher than yourself. And I don't know the answer to that, but either way, the result is the same. And so I think it's important to use these tools and use them wisely.
Do you recall thinking about the world before you ever had any psychedelic experiences, and then after, if your view of the world has changed? I mean, the physical world.
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, I was definitely a little bit more pessimistic prior to, again, more militantly atheist than I am now. But then also just our interpretation of, for instance, the plant kingdom, at least in my experience, that had been altered. I think that there's a lot more going on with plant consciousness than we typically consider. And psilocybe has illustrated that for me.
I remember before I ever had my first psychedelic experience, it was during the time when the young George Bush, the son, was president, and he wasn't that popular in those days, And I remember I was like you, very atheist, and then I was also militant and more cynical and angry, and I was more thinking like, oh, we should figure out a plan to kill him, like. And then after the psychedelic experience, I was told that, oh, don't worry about him, he's a joke, and I became more embracing the cosmic joke and that not worrying about a mosquito, in the bigger scheme of things.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point as well. We do kind of find that we do get lost in the everyday, monotony of our daily lives. And psychedelics do kind of make you just laugh at that a little bit more, and look at it from a different perspective than you may normally look at it. So yeah, it is interesting to see it. The cosmic joke, as you described it, is it's funny to see it from that perspective.
What I find interesting is because I the other night I met this person I hadn't seen in many years, and I knew he was an avid weed smoker, and he was growing it, and he's a heavy user of weed. And I haven't seen him in 15 years, so I asked him if he'd ever tried DMT, because the last time I met him 15 years ago, I mean, neither of us knew what DMT was. So first I wanted to check if he knew by now, and he knew. But when I asked him if he wanted to try that, he leaned back and no. Like, and he hadn't even tried it, so he didn't know what he was saying no to. I knew what you could be afraid of, because I'm a bit nervous taking it, but it's interesting, this thing, how people can be afraid of it even though they haven't really done it. So I'm always amazed at how would they know?
Yeah, I think that some people probably shouldn't do these substances. Some people who, they're in a fragile mental state or anything like that. Cannabis to me is considerably more mild than other things in the category of psychedelics, and I would categorize cannabis in the same realm as psychedelics, primarily from its use as an edible. But smoking cannabis, to me, obviously there is a psychoactive effect, but compared to, say, mushrooms or DMT or anything like that, it is much more easygoing, I would say. Obviously, you're not catapulted into another dimension as you are, with DMT in particular. So I can see why people may be weary of trying it if they're familiar with the idea of what it is, at least conceptually. And I think some people know their limits, but there's also the aspect of people being afraid of the unknown. And granted, when you die, for instance, we're all going to experience the unknown, but some people are, too tied to their ego, I believe, to look outside of that.
I just find it interesting because I was never afraid of the unknown. I'm more afraid of it now when I've seen it.
Yeah.
So have you ever had this experience that it's just too big, like the infinity of if it's your mind or God or whatever you want to call it, this conscious, this energy, this thing you're in when you're in a deep psychedelic experience, how big it is? Does it ever? It's almost like staring into the abyss, and falling in. It can be quite scary. Have you ever had that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it can be overwhelming. It can feel like, feels like you're dead. The ego does kind of subside at times. But at the same time, I don't know about your experiences, but for myself, there is like a sense of calm associated with it as well. Like it's as horrifying as it can be, it's also there's just this aspect to it where you feel comfortable in the state.
That's true. It's a certain vibe. So even when you do a psychedelic ceremony and for some reason it doesn't work, like maybe it's not so visual, this is usually more normal with ayahuasca, where you can have an experience but there's no visuals. You can still feel this calm, this vibe. It's hard to explain. It's a certain mood you get into.
Yeah, and I would say that in some regard, there is probably a physiological aspect to that. But I think also the restraining of your ego by psychedelic substances and the mitigation of the ego by psychedelic substances probably removes some of that fear element that your ego would normally, cause to occur.
So if people want to watch these films, where can they find them?
You can find them on Amazon Prime. And also I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Chris Rice, MA, I believe, youtube.com/Chris Rice, MA.
Are there any other films you've made or working on?
Yeah, I am currently working on a documentary called Sacred Mushroom, A Lost History. And that captures a similar zeitgeist regarding mushrooms as opposed to, DMT or cannabis. And it, explores the history of these substances. But I also, do lectures and other documentary kind of subject matter as well. I do have one, for instance, called Aztec God of Drugs, where it describes like the use of drugs in the pre-Columbian Americas. But yeah, Sacred Mushroom, A Lost History should be out eventually. I think I may release part 1 and release it in segments like that.
Have you ever looked into the indigenous of Australia? Because I always suspect they're doing something, but they're very secretive if they have any substance.
Yeah, although most of my work focuses on the substances people are most interested in, like cannabis and mushrooms, I'm interested in ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology as a whole. And, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia actually use a substance called pituri. Are you familiar with this?
No.
It's like an ashy kind of substance. I believe it consists of multiple things, one of which is very high in nicotine, from my understanding. And I believe they chew it as kind of a quid. But if you look at the art produced by Aboriginal people under the influence of patchouli, it's very similar to Southwestern Native American peyote art. So it seems like, there are parallels there. I've never tried that substance myself in particular, but I have a feeling that it's probably similar in nature to the peyote experience.
The national plant or tree of Australia is it called a wattle? I think it's a heavily it's a lot of DMT in that tree or plant, and it grows everywhere. Bush? No, it's a bush. Sorry, it's a bush. But the problem with this is that DMT is in most things all over the world, and the issue is it's very modern if you want to extract it, that process. So I guess it's the indigenous in the Amazon who made it in that ayahuasca brew version.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I tackle in DMT Lost History. I do believe that, obviously we have a historical record and information about the people of South America using DMT in conjunction with MAOI containing plants. But I have a feeling, and I explored that in that documentary, that that may have happened in parallel elsewhere in the world, in that so many plants in so many regions of the world contain DMT. So many of those plants also exist and grow near other plants that contain MAO inhibitors, basically. And so I basically posit there that that's not the only time that that's happened in history. And again, we don't know that for certain, but we can look at evidence. For instance, I believe it was P.D. Newman who wrote about the Freemason use of acacia in conjunction with Syrian rue to form some type of ayahuasca analog, dating back to, at the very least, probably like the 15 or 1600s. But I would imagine that elsewhere in the world that has probably happened, several times over the course of history. Whether or not it became mainstreamed, on the other hand, is a different story.
Do you have a website, or is it just your YouTube?
YouTube. You can also find me on Instagram, Chris Rice MA on Instagram. Facebook, I believe, is Chris Rice MA as well.
Well, thank you a lot for taking the time to be on the podcast.
All right, absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.
Go to youtube.com/user/Chris Rice MA to see his films and videos, or simply click the link in the program notes. You are humbly invited to support this podcast, and by doing so, keeping it free from corporate influence. Do you want to listen to alchemists, magicians, shamans, and psychonauts? Or do you want to listen to humans possessed by
dark and demonic forces that intends to lure you into their web of consumerism?
I'm sure you choose the former, so please support the podcast. Join us at the round table of the divine mystery as an intergalactic spirit warrior and ally to the glorious art of alchemy. Go to patreon.com/Natural Born Alchemist if you want to become a patron, and for only a couple of bucks a month you will be able to access additional content, deleted episodes and other exclusive material as well, and be able to listen to episodes way before they are released. And if you don't want to do this, that's fine too. You are loved nonetheless. Thank you. I was talking a bit positively about the nomadic lifestyle in this episode. So I figured why not end with the song Nomad by Nameless Archive from the album UK Pacha. Go to namelessarchive.com to check it out some more. All the links can be found over at naturalbornalchemist.com. Symbolically, we are all nomads because our spirit does not stay in the house, in the body. So, if on the macrocosmic scale we are nomads, in spirit then perhaps microcosmically, here on Earth we should also be nomads. A settled spirit is dead. So why have we all settled? Perhaps we should never have given that nomadic life up 100,000 years or so ago. The spirit is a nomad, the body is a droid. Next Sunday is the last of the month, and as usual we're going to listen to some pre-recorded talks. What I have in plan for next Sunday is more of a mix of talks rather than one long one. Also, I think we are going to have some fun as well. Let's not be too serious all of the time. See you soon, friends. Freedom is in the mind. It was easy in the beginning. It will be easy at the end. But we are somewhere in the middle. We can barely see the trend. The silly politics of war, and all-time wasting emotions will not speed us along.